8968-е заседание Совета Безопасности объявляется открытым. Предварительная повестка дня данного заседания гласит: письмо постоянного представителя Российской Федерации при Организации Объединенных Наций от 13 апреля 2014 года на имя председателя Совета Безопасности С-2014/264. Повестка дня утверждается. На основании правила 37 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании представителей Германии и Украины. Решение принимается. На основании правила 39 временных правил процедуры Совета я приглашаю принять участие в данном заседании следующих докладчиков: госпожу Розмари Ди Карло, заместителя генерального секретаря по политическим вопросам и вопросам миростроительства; его превосходительство господина Мика Кинунина, специального представителя действующего председателя ОБСЕ на Украине и в трехсторонней контактной группе; его превосходительство господина Яшара Халита Чевика, главного наблюдателя специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ на Украине, и госпожу Татьяну Монтян, украинскую активистку гражданского общества. Решение принимается. Сейчас Совет Безопасности приступит к рассмотрению пункта 2 повестки дня. И сейчас представляю слово госпоже Розмари Ди Карло.
Thank you, Mr. President. I last briefed this Council on the situation in Ukraine as it relates to the implementation of the Minsk agreements on 11 February 2021. At that time, I drew attention to the fragile security situation that prevailed despite the nominal ceasefire in place. Today, a year since that briefing, tensions in and around Ukraine are running higher than at any point since 2014. Speculation and accusations around a potential military conflict are rife. Whatever one believes about the prospect of such a confrontation, the reality is that the current situation is extremely dangerous. The issues underpinning the current crisis are complex and long-standing. They tie together the 8-year conflict in eastern Ukraine with the larger issues related to European security architecture. Although seemingly intractable, given the stakes involved for our collective security and European stability, these issues can and must be solved through diplomacy in the full use of the many available regional and other mechanisms and frameworks. We support all such efforts, including through the Secretary General's good offices. Mr. President, regrettably, there's been little, if any, meaningful progress in the implementation of the various provisions of the Minsk agreements. Despite repeated efforts, the talks both in the number D4 format and the discussions led by the Trilateral Contact Group remain deadlocked. We welcome the efforts of France and Germany to host the recent N4 discussions to break the current impasse and hope that these will continue. The Minsk agreements remain the only framework endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2202 for a negotiated peaceful settlement of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. In this regard, we note with concern the reports of fresh ceasefire violations across the contact line over the past several hours. If verified, these violations must not be allowed to escalate further. We call on all sides to exercise maximum restraint at this time. We also call on all concerned to refrain from any unilateral measures that may go against the letter and spirit of the Minsk agreements or undermine their implementation and result in further tensions, including related to the status of certain areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. We commend the important work of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. The Council will hear shortly from Ambassador Miko Kinnunen, Special Representative of the OSCE's Chairperson in Office in Ukraine, and Ambassador Khalid Chevik, Chief Monitor of the OSCE's Special Monitoring Mission. It's essential that we support their work, particularly at this critical time. The Special Monitoring Mission, which carries out its crucial functions despite considerable challenges, must enjoy safe and secure conditions. Mr. President, on 14 February, the Secretary General expressed his deep worry regarding a potential military conflict in Europe. He reminded the international community that the price in human suffering, destruction, and damage to European and global security is too high to contemplate. The Secretary General has remained fully engaged with key actors, including the governments of the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and has reiterated the same unambiguous message. There is no alternative to diplomacy. It's incumbent on all member states to fully respect the key principles of the United Nations Charter, to settle disputes by peaceful means, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. In this regard, let me restate the commitment of the United Nations to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders, as called for in GA resolutions. The recent diplomatic contacts, including between heads of state, are welcome. But more needs to be done urgently, including tangible steps on the ground and an end to inflammatory rhetoric to diffuse tensions. Mr. President, as we have done throughout the 8 years of the conflict, the United Nations continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. The UN country team in Ukraine remains fully operational. Our humanitarian colleagues are committed to providing assistance in accordance with the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, humanity, and independence. This includes, for example, 3 humanitarian convoys that delivered over 140 metric tons of life-saving assistance across the contact line since the start of 2022, benefiting thousands of people in need. It's imperative that safe and unimpeded access by humanitarian actors is respected by all sides under any circumstances. Amid the current tensions, we should not lose sight of the existing dire humanitarian needs impacting 2.9 million people, with the majority living in non-government controlled areas of eastern Ukraine. Donor support has allowed us to provide aid to over 1.5 million people during the first 9 months of 2021, the highest level since 2017. This critical achievement must be sustained amid the increasing severity of humanitarian needs. Early and adequate funding of the $190 million 2022 Humanitarian Response Plan is needed to continue to meet the urgent needs of 1.8 million vulnerable people, including over 1 million in government-controlled areas and 750,000 in non-government controlled areas. Mr. President, for the war-weary people of Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts, the impact of COVID-19 on top of the conflict has caused even more grave disruption and suffering. Millions of people who prior to the pandemic could still maintain family and community connectivity have been unable to travel freely across the contact line due to COVID-19 related restrictions. As a consequence of their increased isolation and abrupt loss of access to basic services and livelihoods, the needs of this already vulnerable population have been exacerbated. At the same time, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights continues to document civilian casualties and the impact of hostilities, monitor freedom of movement, and receive and report on allegations of human rights violations. Despite the persistent tensions, last year saw the lowest number of civilian casualties documented by OHCHR since the beginning of the conflict. Overall adherence to the ceasefire has been an important factor in this trend. It must continue. Mr. President, over 14,000 people have already lost their lives in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. As the Secretary General said this week, we simply cannot accept even the possibility of a new conflict in Ukraine. Indeed, we are facing a test. The world is looking to the collective security mechanisms in Europe, but also to this Council to help ease tensions and ensure that the only skirmishes will be diplomatic. We cannot afford to fail. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю госпожу Розмари Ди Карло за ее брифинг. И сейчас предоставляю слово его превосходительству господину Микко Киннунену.
The TCG supports implementation of the settlement provided by the Minsk agreements. However, in times like these, it is impossible to address the Donbas issue without paying attention to the bigger context, which is the tense security situation around Ukraine and in the region, as well as the intensive high-level diplomacy. Arguably, this bigger context has a strong interlinkage with the work of the Trilateral Contact Group. This argument is based on views according to which finding a solution to the main task of the TCG, implementation of the Minsk agreements, could help in solving many of the issues of the bigger picture. However, presently, positions of the participants to the discussions of the TCG are too far from each other. Consequently, as of now, it is not yet possible to solve the conflict related to Eastern Ukraine within the TCG. We need to continue our work. At the same time, it is important to note that all the elements of the three Minsk agreements are relevant and need to be addressed. These agreements, Minsk Protocol, Minsk Memorandum, and the Minsk package of measures continue to form the basis of our work. It is crucial that all sides will continue to remain committed. It is popular to accuse one or another participant to the discussions for violating Minsk agreements or for not wanting to implement Minsk agreements. Here, my message would suggest caution. The fact is that none of the elements of the Minsk agreements has been implemented, or at least fully implemented. Furthermore, in my experience, it is not possible nor appropriate to single out only one party for being responsible for this. Everyone involved in the discussions of the Trilateral Contact Group needs to bear their responsibility for carrying out what has been agreed. We need more flexible positions and readiness to compromise. Mr. President, security situation along the 480 kilometers long contact line that separates government-controlled area from the non-government-controlled area of Eastern Ukraine is one of the key focuses of the work of the TCG. In the present situation, particularly with reference to the bigger contexts, it is important to continue to stay calm also along the contact line. Provocations are to be avoided. At the end of the day, no one would benefit from new military activities. Concrete press example of a potentially provocative situation is the alleged shelling that occurred this morning in Luhansk region, close to the contact line. It is important to try to establish facts in a swift manner and to avoid escalation. One participant to the discussions of the TCG has requested for an extraordinary TCG meeting. Armed conflict related to eastern Ukraine is 8 years old, as referred by the Undersecretary General. The conflict continues, has resulted in over 14,000 victims, hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees. Crossings over the contact line have dropped, civilian crossings, by 95% since the closing of checkpoints 2 years ago, resulting in additional civilian suffering and hardship. Conflict-affected areas with ongoing military activities have sadly become part of everyday life for countless Ukrainian citizens. In late December 2021, 2 months ago, participants to the discussions of the trilateral contact group agreed fully to adhere to the ceasefire agreement of July 2020. This New Year's commitment 2 months ago did not hold well enough. However, the positive side of the matter was, for 1 month period following the commitment, there were 70% less ceasefire violations than during the month before. This once again indicates if there is political will, it is possible not to use arms, possible not to fire. True, there have been small positive steps with our work, such as creation of an environmental expert group. Recent IAEA visit to the non-government controlled area shows that when there is will on all sides, agreeing is possible. But clearly, not enough progress has been made. One reason to this are status-related issues that may, from the outside, appear procedural, but are actually part of the core substance. Mr. President, Excellencies, during this week, the State Duma of the Russian Federation approved a resolution calling upon the Russian president to recognize independence of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. This has caused questions and internal discussion within the TCG. While I know that the Duma resolution does not reflect the official line of the government, it is important to emphasize that all participants need to remain committed to the goal of restoring Ukraine's sovereignty over the totality of its territory. At the same time, the big context, the bigger picture, the unprecedented international focus on Ukraine and the region should be used as an opportunity to intensify, to unblock the work of the TCG. I am grateful for the recent high-level contacts between the leaders of the Normandy 4, as well as the 2 meetings of the Normandy 4 political advisors, and, for example, of the OSCE chairman in office discussions in Kyiv and Moscow during the past days. These all could give new impetus to unblock TCG's work. They could, for example, to give us an opportunity to have and focus, to have substantial discussions on certain concrete draft laws at the very heart of the Minsk agreements. Finally, TCG has now met in video format in online meetings almost for 2 years. Meetings in video format lack drive and confidentiality. For several reasons, they do not offer possibilities for genuine negotiations and interaction. my goal remains to return to face-to-face meetings of our unique platform that does bring together Ukraine, Russia, the OSCE, as well as representatives of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Thank you, Mr. President.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Кинунина за его брифинг. И сейчас я представляю слово его превосходительству господину Яшару Халиду-Чевику.
Thank you, Mr. President. Excellencies, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to brief this Council today. In my capacity as the Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine and as the Coordinator of the Working Group on Security Issues in the Trilateral Group, I will update you on key developments on the situation in eastern Ukraine during the past year. These include the security situation along the contact line, the impact of nearly 8 years of the conflict on civilians, and the SMM's increasingly challenging operational environment. The security situation remains fraught with tension. The gradual frame of the ceasefire I described to the Council last February has regrettably accelerated, and inevitably, civilians on both sides of the contact line continue to bear the burden of the tensions and resulting insecurity. I further have to note with deep concern that the impediments to the SMM's mandated freedom of movement have not only persisted but escalated in the past year. In times of heightened tensions in and around Ukraine, when the mission's impartial and objective reporting is vital, these restrictions are especially unacceptable since they limit the mission's capabilities. The SMM has been vilified in public rhetoric, and mission members have at times been intimidated. Our technical monitoring tools are subjected to intense interference daily. The mission suffered temporary blockades of operations in Donetsk region last October. In Luhansk region, the SMM is also subjected to a blockade. SMM's sustainability is under risk as it has been deprived of its operational freedom and independence. In this context, I also wish to highlight my concern with the fact that the contact line remains exceedingly difficult to cross, both for SMM and civilians. It increasingly looks like and feels like a border, which it transects and divides families and communities and provision of services. Before elaborating on these developments, I wish to stress that in such challenging circumstances, the political will of the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire and reduce tensions is imperative. Silence along the contact line is of utmost importance for allowing space for negotiations. Abstaining from inflammatory public rhetoric is also essential. Mr. President, since I last briefed the esteemed Council, the overall security situation along the contact line in eastern Ukraine has remained volatile. After the unprecedented period of relative calm that followed the 22nd July 2020 Trilateral Contact Group Agreement on measures to strengthen the ceasefire throughout 2021, we saw a gradual but sustained increase in the level of armed violence. In 2021, between August and December in particular, the mission recorded high numbers of ceasefire violations, including increased use of heavy weapons that the sides had committed to withdraw, as well as their consequences in civilian casualties and damage to infrastructure. In November, the SMM recorded levels of kinetic activity, including the more destructive weapons, worryingly close to those recorded prior to July 22nd Measures Agreement. At the 22nd December 2021 TCG meeting, the participants expressed strong determination to uphold the ceasefire regime. The first month following that meeting saw a considerable decrease in the level of violence by some 60%. But tensions nevertheless remain high, fueled also by the wider discussions surrounding the security situation in and around Ukraine. Of serious concern is the fact that in 2021, the SMM recorded ceasefire violations in and near the three symbolically important pilot disengagement areas, including with the use of proscribed weapons. In Luhansk region, in particular, the wider Pervomaisk-Popasna-Zolote area consistently remained a hotspot. On 3 December, the SMM recorded a violent exchange of fire inside and near the Stanitska-Luhansk disengagement and crossing point. This was an especially dangerous situation as civilians in transit, including children, were put at risk. This was the first time since April 2020 that SMM recorded ceasefire violations inside this area. Importantly, there the benefits of this engagement had been clearly demonstrated as it allowed for the reconstruction of the Stanitska-Luhansk bridge, one of the symbols of this conflict. I underline the significance of violence in these three areas as it provides insight into the side's will, or at times its absence, to adhere to their commitments. In this context, I also wish to share my deep concern over the side's holding of live fire exercises inside the security zone throughout 2021 and since the start of 2022. These ceasefire violations deserve our particular attention as they violate both the comprehensive ceasefire regime and the specific TCG decision of 3 March 2016 prohibiting the conduct of such exercises. Last month, they were approximately 10% of all ceasefire violations recorded by the SMM. Since the beginning of 2022, the mission is already recording on average twice as many ceasefire violations per day as it did over the same period in 2021, when the side's adherence to the ceasefire had already started fraying. As I noted, the increasing levels of violence with the use of heavy weapons inevitably led to a rise in the number of corroborated civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire. In 2021, the SMM corroborated more civilian casualties due to shelling and small arms fire, 48, than those caused by mines and other explosive objects. Nearly 60% of the corroborated civilian casualties as a result of shelling and small arms fire, as well as nearly 70% of all cases of damage to civilian objects and the infrastructure sites were recorded between October and November last year. Other violations of commitments undertaken by the sides have also continued. The SMM recorded new trench extensions and improvements to positions, the presence of heavy weapons and military-type positions in residential areas, and the increased use of non-SMM unmanned aerial vehicles. As a last point on this issue, it is worth mentioning that violations occur on either side of the contact line. Mr. President, regrettably, discussions in the working group on security issues have been at an impasse for the past year. In principle agreements reached in 2020 on 19 demining areas, an updated mine action plan, 4 new disengagement areas, and a draft addendum to clarify some aspects of the framework decision on disengagement have not been actioned. The security-related conclusions of the 2019 Normandy 4 Paris summit require new political impetus to be translated into tangible progress. Since April 2021, participants have been discussing a draft addendum to the 22nd July measures agreement, but common ground has yet to be found. As I underlined last year, such mechanism would facilitate the escalation, address the persistent issue of impunity, and contribute to building confidence on the ground. It will demonstrate the sides' political will to act in line with their commitments. Mr. President, I wish to underline that the communities along the contact line are deeply traumatized by living in constant danger and uncertainty. I already mentioned the 48 casualties caused by small arms fire or shelling. In 2021, the SMM corroborated another 43 cases of people injured or killed by mines, unexploded ordnance, and other explosive devices. It is imperative that the sides do their utmost to mitigate these constant threats, even unilaterally, in parallel with the negotiations on overall solutions. Mr. President, the challenges of the ongoing pandemic have also endured and continue to make daily life even more challenging for civilians on both sides of the contact line. The past year saw no improvement in civilians' freedom of movement between the government and non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. Crossing the contact line remains limited to 2 of the 5 existing crossing points. Only the pedestrian crossing at Stanislav Bridge is accessible on a daily basis. There has been no progress in opening of the 2 new crossings at Zolote and Shastia, even though in principle agreement on their opening was reached in July 2020. Even as some of the pandemic-related restrictions were eased last year, official data shows that crossings in 2021 remain a mere 5% of the pre-pandemic levels. These are not just statistics, they represent the elderly who can no longer access their pensions, as well as the young who are losing out on educational and economic opportunities. Access to other services, including healthcare and documentation, such as passports, birth, and death certificates, is being severely curtailed, while people, family, friends, communities are being separated from each other. Estrangement between communities spanning the contact line should not become entrenched. The needs and the rights of civilians should take precedence. Both existing and new crossing points should be fully opened and all restrictions on both sides of the contact line lifted without delay. In these challenging circumstances, it is also vital that critical infrastructure that civilians depend on for their basic needs remain operational and protected from the impact of armed violence. Last year, the SMM continued facilitating and monitoring repairs to gas, water, and electricity infrastructure objects, benefiting millions of civilians on both sides of the contact line. Regrettably, since February 2021, and especially in the wake of an incident inside the disengagement area near Zolote in October, the process of exchanging security guarantees among the sides has been at an impasse, particularly in Luhansk region. I would like to underline that the exchange of security guarantees, which are essential for conducting vital repairs, had previously not been linked to increased tensions on the ground. This process should not be politicized as it is done now. Mr. President, reviewing these challenges, it appears to me that there has never been a greater need for impartial and objective monitoring delivered by SMM. The sides also recognize the importance of the mission's work. Their reactions to the temporary relocation of some mission members last weekend clearly indicated that. Throughout the past year, the SMM has continued managing the challenges I described and performing its mandated tasks. However, since I last briefed this council, the mission's work has continued to be undermined by persistent and escalating constraints on its freedom of movement, predominantly in areas outside government control. I need to underline that freedom of movement is what makes monitoring as foreseen in the mandate. It is essential for enabling the SMM to serve as an impartial eye and ear of the international community in Ukraine. I wish to recall that this freedom of movement is a shrine in the mission's mandate as well as in Minsk agreements. In 2021, some 91% of all freedom of movement restrictions experienced by SMM took place in non-government controlled areas. The past year saw missions movements across the contact line increasingly denied, delayed, and conditioned. These impediments continued to undermine the SMM's operational unity and threaten the sustainability of its work in non-government controlled areas. Impediments to SMM's use of technical monitoring tools have also continued on both sides of the contact line. Instances of gunfire assessed as targeting SMM's unmanned aerial vehicles almost doubled. The intensity of GPS signal interference in 2021 reached unusually high levels. The degradation of our aerial environment in 2021 particularly affected the SMM's long-range UAVs. This platform is the only one that can monitor the full length of the contact line and the areas near the border outside government control 24/7 basis. However, over 80% of the flights encountered interference. Mr. President, the past year has been difficult on many levels. At a time of heightened tensions on the ground and in public rhetoric, it is imperative for the signatories of the Minsk agreements to adhere to all their commitments, first and foremost among them, to strictly adhere to ceasefire regime. Political impasse and increased violence reinforce one another. I hope that the recent resumption of the Normandy 4 consultations and other confidence-building efforts under the auspices of the OSCE will provide much-needed political impetus to relieve tensions in the region and for conflict resolution process to move forward. The restoration of SMM's freedom of movement is meanwhile paramount in order that the mission can do its job. The SMM should be actively supported by the sides in installing new cameras and opening long-planned forward patrol bases. The SMM should again be able to cross the contact line without arbitrary condition and denials. Its unimpeded and unconditional access through the contact line, especially in Luhansk region, must be restored without delay. Attempts to vilify the mission by public accusing it of bias should also come to an end. The impasse in exchange of security guarantees among the sides also requires urgent resolution all along the contact line. The capacity on the ground exists. The will to use it needs to be strengthened and be guided solely by the needs of the long-suffering civilians. The SMM remains available to facilitate constructive efforts in this regard. Mr. President, before concluding my remarks, I would like to highlight 2 points. I remain convinced that the SMM's role remains critical to reducing tensions and fostering peace, stability, and security. Yet, our key challenge has been to ensure the space for the implementation of that mandate. Lacking any way to enforce this implementation, we need the strong and sustained support of the international community to urge the sides to implement their commitments and restore SMM's freedom of movement. Where there is a political will, there is a way, and I remember particularly the reconstruction of the Stanska-Luhansk bridge after so many years and the encouraging periods of quiet that briefly followed the July 22nd measures agreement. Progress is possible. I'm also compelled to highlight the continuing plight of civilians. I have described the death and injury caused by continued exchanges of fire and by mines. However, allow me to also note that with the contact line nearly completely sealed for 2 years already, people-to-people contacts have been greatly disrupted and communities, even families, have been divided due to no fault of their own. This is taking place against the background of other developments that are further deepening the divide between people living on both sides of the contact line. The political challenges of this 8-year conflict should not eclipse the human cost. I implore the signatories of the Minsk agreements to be mindful of these costs and redouble their efforts. I also urge the members of this venerable council to work with the sides and support their efforts to that end. If you allow me, Mr. President, I would also like to give some information about the developments of today's morning hours. Between yesterday evening and 11:20 Kyiv time today, the SMM has recorded 500 explosions along the contact line. The wider areas of disengagement areas near Staniska, Luhansk, Zolote were particularly kinetic. After 11:20, we have recorded about 30 explosions, so the tension may seem to be easy. During the early hours, around noon, the SMM has asked the sides to strictly adhere to the ceasefire commitments. It is critically important to de-escalate immediately to avoid further aggravation of the situation. SMM is aware and is following up on the reports of civilian casualties, damage to civilian infrastructure, and all along the contact line during the last 24 hours. We will continue to follow up the security situation as much as our resources allow, of course. The increased kinetic activity happened along roughly 200 kilometers of the contact line, basically on the Luhansk Oblast, and many SMM patrols are still returning and in the process of reporting. SMM patrols have visited the sites of the alleged damage to kindergarten and railway station in the government-controlled part of Staniska, Luhansk. At the kindergarten, the SMM saw fresh damage to its facade. Of course, the details will be reported after all the corroboration effort has been completed, and we will do it as soon as possible because we are aware of the importance of these reports in reducing the tensions in the area. In Marinka and Karamchuk, where there were allegations, SMM itself didn't register ceasefire violations, and we are going to follow up. We are actually following up the allegations that reached to us. But it is important that the sides are called to reduce tensions and ceasefire, and also they do themselves being mindful of the high tensions in the region. I thank you very much.
Я благодарю его превосходительство господина Черика за его брифинг. А сейчас я предоставляю слово госпоже Татьяне Монтян.
Thank you, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. This is the technician. Can you please unmute your microphone? Ma'am, your microphone is still muted. Please unmute your microphone.
Слышно?
We can hear you now.
Слышно, да? Еще раз добрый день, дамы и господа. Надеюсь, теперь меня слышно.
Ladies and gentlemen, I do hope you can hear me.
Я внимательно прослушала все,
Listened
что
very
говорили
carefully
ораторы
to
до
everything
меня.
that was said
И
by the
хочу
speakers
вам
before me,
сказать,
and
что я
I would
абсолютно
like
уверена,
to say to
что
you
вы
this.
все
I am
прекрасно знаете,
completely
что
certain that you
никогда,
all know
никогда,
very well
никогда
that never,
киевские
ever,
власти
ever
не собирались
the
выполнять
authorities
ни
in Kyiv
первые
had
Минские
the intention
соглашения,
of
ни
implementing
тем
either the
более
first
вторые.
package of
Для
Minsk
них
agreements
это был
and much
просто
less
перерыв
so the second
для
Minsk
того,
agreements. This is
чтобы
simply
сказать, да, мы выполним,
pause
а за это
to be able
время
to say, yes, we're
Запад
going to
накачает
implement
нас
that.
оружием,
In the
укрепит
meantime,
наши
we'll
вооруженные
receive
силы,
weapons from
и мы
NATO, our armed
надеемся, что
forces
через
will
некоторое
become
время
stronger, and we
мы
do hope
попробуем
that in
отбить
some time
мятежные
later
республики
we will be
силой.
able to
Они не
get
то,
back
что не
the
хотят
rebellious
разговаривать с
republics
республиками,
by
и
force.
Зеленский
It's not
сказал об
only
этом
they do
прямо,
not want
вот
to
прямо
talk to the
сейчас,
republics, and this was
что
said by
он не
Zelensky
видит
directly
смысла
just now.
разговаривать с
He said
Донецком и
that he
Луганском.
sees no
Они
reason
не
to have
хотят
dialogue with
разговаривать с
Donetsk and
гражданским
Luhansk.
обществом,
They do not want to
даже
have
внутри
conversations
Украины.
with the
Люди,
civil
которые не
society, even
собираются в
within
Европу,
Ukraine.
в НАТО,
People who do not
которые
want
против
to go to Europe
государственного
or NATO.
переворота,
People who
которые
are
хотят
against the
жить
coup
в мире
d'etat,
и дружбе с
who
Россией и со
want to
всеми
live in
остальными странами,
peace
не
and
то, что
friendship in Russia
абсолютно
and
не
other
представлены в
countries.
украинской
These
политике.
people, not
Они
only are they not
преследуются в уголовном
represented
порядке.
within Ukrainian
Я
politics at
адвокат
all,
по
they are
уголовным
being
делам.
criminally
Мой клиент
prosecuted.
Руслан
I'm a
Кацаба
criminal
просто записал
lawyer.
видео на Ютубе,
Ruslan
что
Kataba
он за мир, что он против
simply
войны на
posted a video
Донбассе.
on YouTube saying that
И
he is in favor of peace
2015
and against
года
war in
его за
Donbass.
это судят
And he
за
has been on
государственную измену.
trial since
Когда
2015,
я
and the
лично
accusation is
поехала
high
на Донбасс
treason.
к одному из
I went
полевых
to
командиров,
Donbass
ныне покойному
personally
Алексею Мозговому,
to
чтобы
visit one of
забрать
the commanders,
пленного
now dead,
из
Mr.
ВСУ,
Moskovoi.
меня
So was
зашли на сайт «Миротворец», где находится
take
огромное количество
a
людей,
detainee
вся
back.
вина которых только в том, что
And I
они за
saw
мир,
a
они
huge
против
number of
Майдана,
people
против
whose only
госпереворота,
fault is
против
that they're
НАТО и
against Maidan,
против
against coup
Европы.
d'etat, against NATO and Europe.
И вы хотите
And
мне
you
сказать,
now
что
want
люди,
to tell me
которые
that
судят
those people
простых
who sit in
обывателей
judgment
за лайк в социальных
over
сетях,
other people's
скажем, гербу
because
Советского Союза, недавно
they
было такое
had
дело.
placed a like in
Люди, которые
social
закрыли все абсолютно оппозиционные
networks.
каналы,
People
которые
who closed
преследуют
all
всех
opposition
оппозиционных
channels, who are
политиков,
prosecuting all
они будут
opposition
разговаривать
politics,
с
that these
Донецком и
people are
Луганском.
going to hold conversation with
Абсолютно
Donetsk and
понятно, что
Luhansk.
это
It is very
невозможно
clear
в
that this
принципе.
is in
Это как
principle and
вещество
a
и
possibility.
антивещество. Они
This is a
взаимно
matter and
аннигилируются.
antimatter. They
Казалось бы, в
annihilate
чем
each other.
проблема? В
So
течение 5
what
лет
is the
дать
problem?
особый
What
статус.
was the
Но они
difficulty
не будут
to
это
provide a
делать,
special
потому что они
status
пресекают
in
в
the past
Украине
5 years?
абсолютно
They are
любое
not going to
инакомыслие.
do that
В
because any
Украине люди,
different
которые
thinking
против
in Ukraine
Майдана,
is being squashed.
госпереворота и против
People who
войны,
are in Ukraine
это
against
враги
Maidan,
народа.
against the coup
Они
d'etat,
не
against
имеют
war, the
права
enemies of the
выступать
people. They
нигде,
have no right to
вообще.
take the
У
floors
них
anywhere,
нет ни
anywhere at all.
политических партий,
They have no
ни
political parties.
общественных
They
организаций.
have
Они лишены
no
права
civil
голоса
society
своей,
associations. They have no right
просто
to
лишены
speak
напрочь.
in
И
their country.
естественно,
They don't have
даже
that right at all.
после
And of
этого вы
course,
хотите, чтобы
even
киевский
after
режим
that,
договаривался с
how
Луганском
can
и
you
Донецком?
ask that
Да я
Kyiv
уверена,
be
что вы
talking to Lugansk
понимаете,
and
что этого не
Donetsk? I
будет
am
никогда,
sure you understand
никогда,
that this will
никогда.
never,
Один
ever,
из
ever
предыдущих
happen.
ораторов
One of
сказал,
the previous
что
speakers
якобы, несмотря на все
well,
усилия
that
Германии и Франции,
I
киевский режим не хочет выполнять Минские
I
соглашения.
regret that despite
Я
the efforts
уверена,
of
что
Germany and France, the
Запад
Kyiv regime does not want to implement
позволяет
the Kyiv
киевскому
agreements.
режиму
I'm
не
certain
выполнять
that the
Минские
West
соглашения.
allows the Kyiv
Если бы
regime
это
to
было не так,
non-implement.
все
If
эти
this were
Минские
not the case,
соглашения давно
all
бы
of the
были
Minsk
выполнены.
agreements would
Не
have been
надо
implemented
говорить,
a
что
long time
Киев хоть
ago. Please
сколько-нибудь
do not
самостоятельный,
say
что
that Kyiv
Украина
is an
хоть
independent
сколько-нибудь
entity here,
независима.
that
Это
Ukraine
колония
is independent.
коллективного
It
Запада,
is
в
a
которой
colony of
все
a collective
решают
West,
люди,
where
которые пришли
everything is
извне, которые
decided by the
people
устроили
who came in
Майдан
from
и
the outside,
госпереворот,
who
и
organized the
захватили
Maidan
мою
and the
страну в
coup
рабство.
d'etat
И
and
вот именно
plunged my
эти
country
люди
into
не
slavery.
дают
And these
исполнить
are the
Минские
same people
соглашения.
stand in the way
И
of
не
implementing the Minsk
дадут.
agreement.
Я в этом
And they will
уверена.
not
Потому
allow
что
the agreements to be
истинная цель
implemented. I'm
Запада,
certain of it.
несмотря на
Because
все
the real
миролюбивые речи,
goal
которые я
of the
слышала в
West,
том числе и
despite
здесь,
all the
это
peace-loving speeches I've
натравить
heard,
киевский
including
режим
here,
на
is
республики
to
и
make sure that
втянуть
Kyiv attacks
Россию
the
в войну.
republics and the Russia is
Абсолютно
bogged
никакого
into this war.
объяснения западной
No
истерии на тему, что
explanation
Россия
for the
вот-вот
Western
нападет,
hysterics
и
when they say
Байден
that
это
Russia
сказал
is
буквально
about
вот
to
только
invade.
что.
And
Я
Biden just
слышала как
said,
раз в
I just listened
процессе
to it
этого мероприятия.
as we were having this meeting.
Других целей у
That's
Запада
what he said.
нет.
There is no
Только
other goal
организовать
that the West
войну.
has.
Если бы
The only
это было
goal
не
is
так,
to
то
organize war.
марионеточное
If this were
правительство
not the
Украины
case, then
давно
the
было бы
puppet
принуждено
government
к
of
исполнению
Ukraine would
Минских
have been
соглашений.
compelled to
А раз
implement the Minsk
этого
agreements
не
a long time
происходит,
ago. And since
значит,
this is
можно
not taking place,
констатировать только
then we
одно.
can state one
Запад
thing and one
хочет
thing
войны
only.
с
The
Россией.
West
И
wants
чтобы
a
эта
war
война
with Russia.
происходила на
And
территории
it
Украины.
wants that war
Мы
to take place on the
шахматная
territory
доска,
of
а
Ukraine.
народ
We're
Украины
not a
и люди
chessboard, we
в
are a
непризнанных
people of Ukraine.
республиках
And
это
the
просто
people
разменная
in the
монета в
unrecognized
геополитических
republics are
играх.
simply pawns in
Больше
political
нечего
games.
здесь сказать. И
There's
я
nothing else
уверена,
that
вы
can be said
прекрасно
here.
это
And I
знаете
am
и
sure
понимаете.
that you
И я
yourselves
очень
understand
рада,
that very
что
well.
я
I'm very
смогла
happy
сказать
that
вам
I
это
had
в
the
лицо.
opportunity to
Я
say this to your
уверена,
face.
что вы таки
I am
доведете
convinced
до войны.
that you
Сегодняшние
will
события
lead
с
the
утра в
events
республиках,
to
когда
a
они были
war. The
обстреляны
events
по
today
всему
in the
периметру, по
republics
всей
when
линии
they were
соприкосновения,
shelled
окончательно
throughout the
меня
contact
в этом
line
убедили.
have convinced me of
Украина,
that
киевский
completely.
режим в течение
Ukraine,
вот
the
уже
Kyiv
почти 8
regime,
лет
for almost
обстреливает
8
около
years
100 тысяч
have been
людей из
shelling
тяжелой
about
артиллерии.
100,000 people
ОБСЕ,
using
которые
heavy
имеют
artillery.
прозвище на тех территориях слепые наблюдатели,
OSCE have
вообще
the
на
moniker
это
of
никак не
blind
реагируют.
observers in the territories
На
react to
стороне
this
подконтрольной
not at all.
киевскому режиму
That
не убивают
side
детей. Ни одного ребенка
which
не
is
было
under the control
убито.
of the Kyiv
Не
regime,
разрушают
children are
дома.
not killed, not a single
Все
child
это
has been killed,
происходит
and
только в
buildings are
непризнанных
standing up.
республиках.
This only
Я
happens
была там
in the
лично. Я
unrecognized
говорю не
republic,
из
and I
чужих
visited
слов.
them
Я
personally.
проехалась
I
по
am telling
всей
you
линии
this about
соприкосновения.
firsthand
Там
because I
убивают
traveled down the
именно
entire
мирное
contact line,
население,
and I saw
самых
how peaceful
беззащитных
civilians,
людей,
unprotected,
которые не
vulnerable people
смогли
are
оттуда
being killed.
уехать,
The
потому что
people
это
who did
или
not
старики,
manage to
или
leave,
женщины с
their
детьми,
old people,
или
the women
инвалиды.
with
Те,
children,
кто
or
мог
their
оттуда
handicapped.
уехать,
Those who
уехали
could
оттуда
have
уже
left,
очень давно.
left
И вот
the area a
именно
long time
эти
ago.
люди,
So these
страдальцы и заложники,
long-suffering
там
people are
находятся, и их 100
hostages
тысяч
there,
человек.
and
И
they're in the
вся
number of
Европа
100,000.
лицемерно
And
и
the
кровожадно
entire Europe
смотрит
is,
8-й год на
for the
страдания
8th
этих
year
людей,
running,
не
looking
забывая при этом рассказывать, что
duplicitously
Минские
at the suffering
соглашения
of these people, whilst at
безальтернативны.
the same time
Так
saying that there
заставьте
is
своих
no alternative
марионеток
to
из
the Minsk agreements.
киевского
Well,
режима
fine,
их
then
исполнить. Или
compel your
прекратите уже
marionettes
говорить,
from the Kyiv
что
regime to
они
implement them, and
безальтернативны.
please, or stop
Спасибо за
saying that there is no
внимание.
alternative to them. I thank you for your attention.
Монтян за ее брифинг.
I thank Ms. Tatiana Manchan for her briefing.
Сейчас я сделаю заявление в своем качестве заместителя министра иностранных дел Российской Федерации. Хотели бы поблагодарить за высказанные оценки заместителя генсекретаря ООН Розмари Ди Карло, спецпредставителя действующего представителя ОБСЕ в Минской контактной группе Мика Кинунина и главу специальной мониторинговой миссии ОБСЕ Халита Чевика. Признательны госпоже Татьяне Монтян за ценную весьма информацию из первых рук о том, как реализуется на практике решение Совета Безопасности ООН по урегулированию внутриукраинского конфликта. Дата сегодняшнего заседания выбрана нами не случайно. В этот день, 7 лет назад, Совет Безопасности ООН в своей резолюции 2202 единодушно утвердил комплекс мер по выполнению Минских соглашений в качестве единственной международно-правовой основы регулирования гражданского конфликта на востоке Украины. Именно поэтому основной задачей сегодняшней встречи мы видим подтверждение Совета Безопасности безальтернативности этого судьбоносного судьбоносного для
in
Украины
reaffirming by the
документа.
Security Council
К
of the fact that
сожалению,
there is no
спустя
alternative
7
to
лет
this
у
momentous
нас
for
появляется
Ukraine
все больше оснований
document.
полагать,
Unfortunately,
что
7 years
реализация
down the
Минского
road, we
комплекса
are
мер
increasingly
в планы наших
thinking that
украинских
the
соседей по-прежнему
implementation
не
of
входит.
the Minsk
Они уже
agreements is
говорят
not
об этом
something
в открытую.
that's in the plans of
Приведу
our
лишь
Ukrainian
несколько
neighbors.
наиболее
They're
свежих
stating
примеров.
that openly
Буквально
now.
вчера
Let me give you some examples.
вице-премьер-министр
As recently as
Украины
yesterday, the Vice Prime Minister
Ирина
of
Верещук
Ukraine,
утверждала,
Irina
что никаких
Vereshchuk,
новых законов
stated
об особом статусе
that
Донбасса,
there
никаких
will
согласований
be
напрямую
no
не будет.
new
Это я
laws on the
цитирую.
special status of
И это после
Donbass, or
разговора
no
Зеленского с
direct
канцлером
agreements.
Шольцем.
And this took place
Она,
after
кстати,
Zelensky had
тогда же
a
призналась, что
meeting with
никакого давления
Chancellor
со стороны
Scholz.
Запада
She
по
also
выполнению Минска
acknowledged that
Киев
there
не
is no
ощущает.
pressure exerted by West on
4
them to
февраля в
implement the
интервью
Minsk
украинскому
agreements.
телеканалу
On the
1
4th of
плюс 1
February,
Миндел
there was
Украины
an
Кулеба заявил,
interview
что
by the
Минские
Ukrainian channel
соглашения
1+1
не могут
by
быть
the Minister
выполнены
of
на
Foreign
российских
Affairs,
условиях,
Kuleba.
к которым
He
он
said that the
почему-то
Minsk
отнес
agreement
прямой диалог
cannot
между
be
Украиной и
implemented
Донбассом.
on Russian terms,
Хотя
and in
это
those
условие
terms he
четко
thinks is direct
зафиксировано в
dialogue
комплексе мер.
between Ukraine and
Эту же мысль
Donbass, despite the
проводил
fact that
глава
this is
офиса
clearly
президента
stated in
Украины
the package
Ермак
of measures.
на недавней
This
встрече
same idea was
политсоветников в
expressed
нормандском
by the
формате
head of
в Париже.
presidential
Ранее,
Ukrainian
2
presidential
февраля,
administration
Кулеба
Yermak
утверждал,
at the
что ни один
recent
регион
meeting
Украины
in
не будет
Normandy.
иметь права
Earlier,
вето
on
на
the 2nd of
общегосударственные
February, Mr.
решения.
Kuleba said that
Это
no
высечено в
Ukrainian
камне.
region will
Так
have
что
a veto
никакого особого
right
статуса,
on
как
state
представляет
decision. This
Россия,
is
никакого
cast
права
in
вето не
stone.
будет.
So there will be no special
Днем ранее,
status,
1
as
февраля,
Russia says,
Зеленский
no
тоже напомнил
veto.
всему миру
One
о
day earlier, on the 1st of
недоговороспособности
February,
Украины,
Zelensky also
намекая на
recalled
наличие
for the world
альтернативного решения
entire
конфликта в
of
Донбассе. Он
Ukraine's
сказал, что
inability
в
to
Киеве по-разному
negotiate.
относятся к порядку
He
выполнения тех
hinted at an
или иных пунктов
alternative
Минских соглашений.
solution to the conflict in Donbass
31
and says
января
that
в интервью
Kyiv
агентства
has
Associated
a
Press
different view to
секретарь Совета
the
национальной
order of
безопасности
the
и обороны Украины
implementing
Данилов
the provisions of the Minsk
заявил о том,
agreement.
что
On the
выполнение
31st of
Минских
January,
соглашений
in an interview
означает
to the
разрушение
Associated
страны.
Press, the
Когда
Secretary
они
of
были
National
подписаны
Security
под дулом
Defense
русских
Council
пушек, а
stated
немцы
that
и
the
французы
implementation
смотрели,
of the Minsk
всем
agreement
разумным
means
людям уже было
destroying of the
ясно, что
country.
реализовать эти
They
документы
were signed
невозможно.
at the barrel of Russian
Конец цитаты.
guns, and Germans and the
Украинские
French
политики
looked on,
последовательно
and
пытаются
every
укоренить на Западе
rational
мнение о
person
том,
understood that
что
the
Минские
implementation is
соглашения
impossible.
противоречат
Ukrainian
интересам Украины.
politics are trying
Но
to
если задача
implant the
построения
opinion
мира на своей
in the
земле
West that
входит в
the
национальные
Minsk
интересы Украины,
agreements are against the national
подобных
interest of Ukraine.
утверждений
But
быть не
if the
должно.
goal of building
Другая
peace on their own land
отговорка
is part of the
подобного
national
рода
interest of
о
Ukraine,
том,
well,
что
such
якобы
statements are out
некие
of
свои
place.
обязательства по Минским
Another
соглашениям
excuse that we
не
hear
выполняет
here is
Россия.
that Russia is not implementing
Не
some of
исключаю,
its
что
obligations
подобные
in the Minsk
утверждения мы
agreements.
услышим и
And it is very
сегодня.
possible that this is
При
something
этом
that
очевидно,
we'll
что
also
для
hear
такой
here
постановки
today.
вопроса нет никаких
At the same
оснований,
time, it's obvious
так
that there are
как
absolutely no
упоминание
grounds
России
for
в
that
тексте
because
Минских
there is
соглашений
no mention of Russia
Приведу
in
только
the
одно
text
мнение на
of
этот
the
счет,
Minsk agreements.
причем не
Let me just
кого-либо,
give you
а
one
бывшего
opinion
судьи
on this,
Конституционного
not
суда
by
Украины
anyone,
Виктора
but by a
Шишкина,
judge from
который
the
недавно предложил открыть
Constitutional
уголовные дела
Court
против
of
причастных к
Ukraine.
подписанию
He very
Минских
recently
соглашений
proposed
Леонида
opening
Кучмы и
criminal
Петра Порошенко.
prosecution
Последний
against
обвиняется в том, что,
those who
цитирую,
participated
Минск
in the
предусматривает
working out of
20
Minsk
обязательств
agreements,
для
Leonid
Украины,
Kuchma and Petro
6
Poroshenko. And the
для
reason, he says, and I
ОБСЕ,
quote,
для
Minsk
2
provides
для
for 20
Донбасса и ни
obligations placed on
одного
Ukraine,
для
6
России.
on
Конец
OSCE,
цитаты.
2 on Donbass, and not a
Уважаемые
single one
коллеги,
for Russia. End of quote.
позвольте мне еще раз
Colleagues,
кратко напомнить
please
содержание
allow me to
документа,
yet once again
которому
very
посвящено
briefly
наше сегодняшнее
recall the
заседание.
contents of the document we're
Перечислю его
discussing
по
at this
пунктам.
meeting of ours.
Порядок
Let me
выполнения
list it
которых
item
четко
by item,
прописан
and the
и
order
не
in
может
which
быть
they are to be
изменен.
implemented is very clearly
Первое
stated. It cannot
прекращение
be
огня.
changed. First,
Второе отвод
ceasefire.
вооружений.
Second, withdrawal of
Третье
weapons. 3,
мониторинг ОБСЕ.
OSCE monitoring.
Четвертое
4,
начало
launching a
диалога Киева с
dialogue
Донбассом.
between Kyiv and
Пятое
Donbass.
амнистия.
5,
Шестое
amnesty.
обмен
6,
удерживаемыми лицами.
exchange of detainees.
Седьмое
7,
гуманитарный
humanitarian
доступ.
access.
Восьмое отмена
8,
экономической блокады.
lifting the economic
Девятое
blockade.
передача Киеву
9,
контроля над
transfer to the
границей, если
Kyiv
выполнен
border
пункт
control,
11.
provided
Десятое
item
вывод
11
иностранных
is
формирований
implemented.
военных
10,
прав.
withdrawal
11.
of
Новая
foreign formations
конституция,
and mercenaries.
закрепляющая особый
11,
статус
new
Донбасса.
constitutions
12.
providing special
Согласование
status for
порядка
Donbass.
проведения выборов.
12,
И 13.
agreeing on the order of conducting
интенсификация
elections,
работы
and 13,
контактной группы в
intensifying the work of the contact group
Спустя
in Minsk.
7 лет очевидно,
7
ни одно из
years down the
положений
road, it
комплекса
is
мер
clear
Украиной
that none of the
Украиной
provisions of the package
полноценно
of
не
measures
выполнено.
have been implemented
Начиная
by
с первого
Ukraine in
пункта
full.
прекращения огня.
Starting with the first one,
Корень проблемы –
ceasefire.
систематическое
And the
нежелание
root of
Киева
the problem
вступать в
here is
прямой диалог
systematic
с
lack of
полномочными
desire of
представителями
Kyiv
Донецка и
to
Луганска
get
в
into a
контактной
direct
группе.
dialogue with the authorized representative of
Это при том,
Donetsk
что
and
такой диалог
Lugansk in the
прямо
contact group.
предусматривается пунктами
Whereas
4,
this is a
9,
dialogue that is
11 и
clearly
12 этого
directly
документа.
provided in items
Это
4,
не какое-то
9,
наше
11, and
требование,
12 of the
а
document. This
зафиксированное
is
в
not our
документе
requirement.
обязательство
This is
Украины.
something that
И
is
именно его
stated
наши
in the
соседи все
document.
громче
It's an
ставят под
obligation on
сомнение,
Ukraine. And this is something
рискуя
that
таким
our
образом
neighbors
нарушить весь
increasingly
Минский
bring into
процесс
question.
с губительными
And
для Украины
thus,
последствиями. Украина
risk
упорно
undermine the
отказывается от
whole Minsk
реализации
process,
положений
which could lead to
комплекса мер о прямом
devastating
диалоге с
consequences for
Донбассом,
Ukraine.
о порядке
Ukraine
временного
stubbornly
самоуправления,
refuses to implement
восстановления
the provisions of
социально-экономических связей и
the
проведения
Minsk on
конституционной реформы для закрепления
direct
особого
dialogue with
статуса
Donbass,
региона. В
interim
настоящее время в Верховную
self-governance,
Раду внесен несогласованный с Донбассом
restoring socioeconomic
законопроект о
links,
децентрализации,
constitutional
не
reform. And
предусматривающий особого
currently,
статуса
the
региона.
Verkhovная Rada has a draft
Украинская
on
сторона взяла курс на
decentralization. It's
полный
not agreed
отказ от
with
прямого
Donbass and it does
взаимодействия
not
с
provide for a
Донбассом
special
в
status.
рамках координационного
Ukrainian
механизма,
side
предлагая
has
различные
taken
варианты,
course to
не позволяющие
completely
эффективно реагировать
move
на случаи
away from
нарушения
a direct
режима
interaction
прекращения
with
огня.
Donbass within the coordination
Попытки
mechanism.
переложить
And
ответственность
they are
на Россию,
providing various
выставить ее
options, but they
стороной
do not
конфликта,
allow for
несостоятельны
effective
и
reaction
не
in
имеют
case there
под
are
собой
violations.
оснований.
Attempts to place the blame
Не
on
могу не сказать, что
Russia
нас крайне
are
разочаровывает,
futile
как минимум,
and
страусиная
baseless, and
позиция
this
наших
only
западных коллег,
hides the goal of
пытающихся
shifting
не
the
замечать
blame
эти
away
очевидные
from
вещи.
Ukraine. I
Удивляет также,
must
что, вводя
say
в
that
тень
we
Минский
are
комплекс
very
мер, они делают
disappointed by the
акцент на работу
ostrich-like
на
position of
обманском
our
формате.
Western colleagues who are
Хочу
trying
напомнить,
not
что
to see
нормандский
obvious
формат,
things. We
согласно
are
приложению 2
surprised that they're
резолюции
putting to
2202
the
Совета
shadow the Minsk
Безопасности
complex
ООН,
of measures, but they
является
are
контрольным
placing
механизмом
the
по выполнению
emphasis on
Минских
the Norman
соглашений,
format. I'd
а
like to
отнюдь
recall the
не
Norman
форматом
format,
согласования
according to
новых
Annex
решений.
2 of the
На
resolution, is a
протяжении
mechanism
7
to
лет
control implementation, but
Россия
not
на
a
всех
place where
возможных
new
площадках
decisions could be
призывала
discussed.
западных
For 7
покровителей
years,
Киева надавить
Russia
на
has
своих
been
подопечных
calling
для
in all
выполнения Минских
platforms
соглашений.
for
Вместо
the
этого они
Western
занимались полностью
sponsors
противоположным.
to exert pressure on
Растущее
Kyiv
чувство
to implement the
безнаказанности
Minsk
и
agreements.
вседозволенности подстрекало
They were
горячие
doing
головы в
exactly
Киеве
the
на
opposite. So
бесконечные
the
новые
increasing
отговорки
feeling
и
of
военные авантюры
impunity
против собственного
pushed the
народа.
Ukrainian hotheads
В результате
to new
мы
excuses
имеем
and military
то, что
adventures
имеем.
against their own people. And
Тысячи
this is
жертв
what we have.
внутреннего
We have
вооруженного конфликта.
thousands of
Многомиллионное
victims
население
of the
Донбасса
internal armed
по-прежнему
conflict.
выставляется
Many
чужим
millions in
в
Donbass
собственной стране.
are still
Против него направлены
presented
дулы
as foreigners in
автоматов,
their own
снайперских
country.
винтовок
They
и
have
гаубиц,
automatic
нацеленных
rifles,
ударные
sniper
беспилотники.
rifles, howitzers, and
А украинские
strike drones
представители продолжают
targeted at
придумывать
them.
новые поводы, не
Ukrainian
выполнять свои
representatives
обязательства и отдавать приказы
keep
на
coming up
расстрелы
with new
мирного населения.
excuses not to implement their
Вы знаете, что такое
agreements
аллея ангелов? Это мемориальный комплекс
order
в
to
Донецке
shell
в
their
память о
own
детях,
people. There is
погибших
an
от
alley
рук
of
украинских
angels, a
военных.
memorial complex in
Таких,
Donetsk
как
to
те, которые
commemorate the
погибли на
children
детском пляже
who
донбасского
died
города
at the hands of
13 августа
Ukrainian military.
2014 года он стал
Those who
мишенью для
died
ВВС
at the
Украины.
children's
В результате
beach in
обстрела тогда
Zurgus
погибли
on the
более
13th
20
of August, he
человек,
was
десятки
targeted by the
получили
Air Force of
ранения.
Ukraine. 20
Местная
people
жительница,
died,
24-летняя
dozens were
Анастасия
wounded.
Рубин,
A
была на том пляже вместе со
24-year-old
своим
Anastasia
двухлетним
Rubin,
сыном
a
Максимом,
local, was
когда
there with
ВСУ
her
начали обстрел
son
города из
at the
ракетной системы
time when the
залпового
Ukrainian
огня.
Air Force started
Один из
shelling the
снарядов
town
разорвался прямо рядом с
from
ними.
their multiple
Вокруг было все в
rocket launch
дыму, в
system.
крови. На
One
земле лежали
of the
окровавленные
charges
человеческие
exploded
вспоминания
right
детства.
next to them. Everything was
Этот
covered
и
in
многие
blood and
другие подобные
smoke
эпизоды собраны
and
Следственным комитетом
bloodied
России
bodies of
и
children.
медиахолдингом РТ
This and
подборки
other
преступлений
similar
украинских
episodes were
военных с
compiled
применением
by the
запрещенных
investigative
средств и
committee of
методов
Russia
ведения
and
войны.
the RT
Наше
media
представительство при
in a
ООН распространило
compilation
вчера эти материалы среди государств
showing
членов
the
Совета
Ukrainian
Безопасности ООН.
military using
Попрошу
prohibited means of
посмотреть
ways
эти
of
материалы. Но
means,
попрошу быть
and
готовым,
our
что вы
UN mission
увидите
have
ужасную
compiled
сцену.
that and disseminated this to members of the
О
Security
том, как
Council.
Киев
Please
привержен
take a look at
выполнению
them. You'll be
обязательств по
horrified
комплексу
by
мер,
them.
свидетельствует о похищении в
The
октябре
Kiev's
прошлого года
commitment
наблюдателя от
to
Луганска в
the
совместном
complex of
центре по
measures can
координации и
also be
контролю Андрея Косяка.
illustrated by the
Господин Кинунин,
abduction
был бы
last
вам
year
признателен за рассказ об этом
in
эпизоде.
Lugansk
Знаем,
from
что
the
этот
Joint Center on Convention
вероломный поступок стал
Control
прямым
of
нарушением
Andrea
пункта
Cossack.
5
Mr.
комплекса
Kinnunen, we
мер,
would be very grateful
который
if you could tell
запрещает
us about this
преследование и
episode.
наказание лиц
This
за
is a
событиями,
treacherous
имевшими место в
event,
отдельных
and
районах
it is a direct
Донецкой и
violation
Луганской
of
областей
item
Украины
5
для
of the conflict
преследования.
measures, which prohibits the prosecution
Уважаемые
and
коллеги,
punishment of persons in
в завершение хотел бы выразить
connection
надежду,
with
что
the events
представители
in
западных
Donetsk and
стран
Luhansk.
удержатся от соблазна
Colleagues,
в
I
угоду
would like to
телекамерам
finally say that
превратить
you will
наше
be able to
сегодняшнее
resist
заседание
the
в
temptation
площадку
to
для
play to the
безосновательных,
cameras
агрессивных,
and will
словесных
not
упражнений
make this
и
meeting of
вынесем на
ours
него свои
into a
ничем не
circus,
подтвержденные обвинения
will
в том, что
not
Россия якобы
present
собирается
here
напасть на
baseless
Украину.
accusations saying
Мне
that
кажется,
Russia
уже было
allegedly was
достаточно
going to
спекуляций
attack
на эту
Ukraine.
тему, в том
I think we've had enough speculation on that, including the Security Council meeting on the 31st of January convened by the United States. We have long ago clarified everything and explained everything, and the announced date of the so-called invasion is behind us, so therefore my advice to you is not present yourself in an awkward situation. I thank you for your attention. And
я
now
представляю
I
слово
resume
Его
my
Превосходительству,
function
государственному
as
секретарю
President
Соединенных
of the
Штатов
Council.
Америки,
And I now give the floor to
господину
His
Энтони
Excellency,
Блинкену.
Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Mr. President, this council was convened today to discuss the implementation of the Minsk agreements, a goal that we all share, despite Russia's persistent violations. These agreements, which were negotiated in 2014 and 2015 and signed by Russia, remain the basis for the peace process to resolve the conflict in eastern Ukraine. This council's primary responsibility, the very reason for its creation, is the preservation of peace and security. As we meet today, the most immediate threat to peace and security is Russia's looming aggression against Ukraine. The stakes go far beyond Ukraine. This is a moment of peril for the lives and safety of millions of people, as well as for the foundation of the United Nations Charter and the rules-based international order that preserves stability worldwide. This crisis directly affects every member of this council and every country in the world. Because the basic principles that sustain peace and security, principles that were enshrined in the wake of 2 world wars and a Cold War, are under threat. The principle that one country cannot change the borders of another by force. The principle that one country cannot dictate another's choices or policies or with whom it will associate. The principle of national sovereignty. This is the exact kind of crisis that the United Nations, and specifically this Security Council, was created to prevent. We must address what Russia is doing right now to Ukraine. Over the past months, without provocation or justification, Russia has amassed more than 150,000 troops around Ukraine's borders, in Russia, Belarus, occupied Crimea. Russia says it's drawing down those forces. We do not see that happening on the ground. Our information indicates clearly that these forces, including ground troops, aircraft, ships, are preparing to launch an attack against Ukraine in the coming days. We don't know precisely how things will play out. But here's what the world can expect to see unfold. In fact, it's unfolding right now, today, as Russia takes steps down the path to war and reissued the threat of military action. First, Russia plans to manufacture a pretext for its attack. This could be a violent event that Russia will blame on Ukraine, or an outrageous accusation that Russia will level against the Ukrainian government. We don't know exactly the form it will take. It could be a fabricated so-called terrorist bombing inside Russia, the invented discovery of a mass grave, a staged drone strike against civilians, or a fake, even a real, attack using chemical weapons. Russia may describe this event as ethnic cleansing or a genocide, making a mockery of a concept that we in this chamber do not take lightly, nor do I take lightly, based on my family history. In the past few days, Russian media has already begun to spread some of these false alarms and claims to maximize public outrage, to lay the groundwork for an invented justification for war. Today, that drumbeat is only intensified in Russia's state-controlled media. We've heard some of these basic allegations from Russian-backed speakers here today. Second, in response to this manufactured provocation, the highest levels of the Russian government may theatrically convene emergency meetings to address the so-called crisis. The government will issue proclamations declaring that Russia must respond to defend Russian citizens or ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Next, the attack is planned to begin. Russian missiles and bombs will drop across Ukraine. Communications will be jammed. Cyber attacks will shut down key Ukrainian institutions. After that, Russian tanks and soldiers will advance on key targets that have already been identified and mapped out in detailed plans. We believe these targets include Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, a city of 2.8 million people. And conventional attacks are not all that Russia plans to inflict upon the people of Ukraine. We have information that indicates Russia will target specific groups of Ukrainians. We've been warning the Ukrainian government of all that is coming. And here today, we are laying it out in great detail with the hope that by sharing what we know with the world, we can influence Russia to abandon the path of war and choose a different path while there's still time. Now, I'm mindful that some have called into question our information, recalling previous instances where intelligence ultimately did not bear out. But let me be clear. I am here today not to start a war, but to prevent one. The information I presented here is validated by what we've seen unfolding in plain sight before our eyes for months. And remember that while Russia has repeatedly derided our warnings and alarms as melodrama and nonsense, they have been steadily amassing more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, as well as the capabilities to conduct a massive military assault. It isn't just us seeing this. Allies and partners see the same thing. And Russia hasn't only been hearing from us. The international chorus has grown louder and louder. If Russia doesn't invade Ukraine, then we will be relieved that Russia changed course and proved our predictions wrong. That would be a far better outcome than the course we're currently on. And we'll gladly accept any criticism that anyone directs at us. As President Biden said, this would be a war of choice. And if Russia makes that choice, we've been clear, along with allies and partners, that our response will be sharp and decisive. President Biden reiterated that forcefully earlier this week. There's another choice Russia can still make if there's any truth to its claim that it's committed to diplomacy. Diplomacy is the only responsible way to resolve this crisis. An essential part of this is through implementation of the Minsk agreements, the subject of our session today. There are a series of commitments that Russia and Ukraine made under Minsk, with the OSCE and the Normandy format partners involved as well. If Russia is prepared to sit with the Ukrainian government and work through the process of implementing these commitments, our friends in France and Germany stand ready to convene senior-level discussions in the Normandy format to settle these issues. Ukraine is ready for this, and we stand fully ready to support the parties. Progress toward resolving the Donbass crisis through the Minsk agreements can reinforce the broader discussions on security issues that we're prepared to engage in with Russia, in coordination with our allies and partners. More than 3 weeks ago, we provided Russia with a paper that detailed concrete reciprocal steps that we can take in the near term to address our respective concerns and advance the collective security interests of Russia, the United States, and our European partners and allies. This morning, we received a response, which we're evaluating. Earlier today, I sent a letter to Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, proposing that we meet next week in Europe, following on our talks in recent weeks, to discuss the steps that we can take to resolve this crisis without conflict. We're also proposing meetings of the NATO-Russia Council and the OSCE Permanent Council. These meetings can pave the way for a summit of key leaders in the context of de-escalation to reach understandings on our mutual security concerns. As lead diplomats for our nations, we have a responsibility to make every effort for diplomacy to succeed, to leave no diplomatic stone unturned. If Russia is committed to diplomacy, we're presenting every opportunity for it to demonstrate that commitment. I have no doubt that the response to my remarks here today will be more dismissals from the Russian government about the United States stoking hysteria or that it has no plans to invade Ukraine. So let me make this simple. The Russian government can announce today, with no qualification, equivocation, or deflection, that Russia will not invade Ukraine. State it clearly, state it plainly to the world, and then demonstrate it by sending your troops, your tanks, your planes back to their barracks and hangars, and sending your diplomats to the negotiating table. In the coming days, the world will remember that commitment, or the refusal to make it. I yield the floor.
Я благодарю
I thank
Его
His
Превосходительство,
Excellency,
государственного секретаря США Антони Блинкена,
Secretary of State
и
of the United States,
приглашаю,
Mr.
предоставляю
Blinken,
слово Его
and
Превосходительству
I
государственному
now give
министру
the
по делам
floor
Европы и Северной Америки,
to
Соединенного
Minister
Королевства
of State for
Великобритании и
Europe and North
Северной Ирландии,
America of the United
господину
Kingdom, Great
Джеймсу
Britain and
Клеверли.
Northern Ireland, Mr. James Cleverly.
I thank you, and I thank the briefers for the information they've given today. The United Nations, the OSCE, and the mandate of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission continue to command our full support. The rights of all Ukrainian, whether they are in Kyiv, Lviv, Donetsk, Luhansk, can only be served by peace, diplomacy, and dialogue.